Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is a computer-generated reading of Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is free and licensed by Mitchell Heisman for copying and distribution under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivative Works 3.0 United States license. Revolt of the Genes. My entire political creed consists of nothing but the bloodiest hatred for our whole civilization, contempt for all things deriving from it, and a longing for nature. No one in France knows that we are human, except perhaps Proudhon, and even he not quite clearly. But in all Europe I prefer dogs to these dog-like men. Yet I don't despair of a better future. Only the most terrific and destructive revolution could make our civilized beasts human again. 1341. Richard Wagner. By 1943 Heidegger no longer expected salvation from the Hitler movement. While he denigrated official Nazism as another realization of technological nihilism, he still believed, throughout the carnage of that war, that the Germans had preserved something that the West had lost. The planet is in flames. The essence of man has come apart. Only we Germans, granted that we find and protect what is German, can arrive at world historical awareness. This is not arrogance, but it is the knowledge of the necessity of an original exigency. 1945 represents the decisive historical turning point in the culture clash with civilization. Even if, on a demographic and political level, Western civilization declines, the material development set in motion by that victory is poised towards civilization's conquest of culture. It can be modified, but not undone, without total self-destruction. In other words, the question of culture versus civilization, man versus machine, biological revolution versus non-biological material evolution has already been decided. The defeat of the Germans and Japanese represented the defeat of the last stand of biology's mastery over technology. The age of biological supremacy is coming to an end. Technologies evolve into existence precisely because of their advantage over biological equivalents. The cumulative effect of technological evolution will ultimately surpass even genetically engineered post-humans. As roboticist Hans Moravec explained, protein is not an ideal material. It is stable only in a narrow temperature and pressure range, is very sensitive to radiation, and rules out many construction techniques and components. A genetically engineered superhuman would be just a second-rate kind of robot, designed under the handicap that its construction can only be by DNA-guided protein synthesis. Only in the eyes of human chauvinists would it have an advantage. 1346. Attempts to perfect human biology with new biotechnological methods will be like attempts to perfect the vacuum tube in the face of the new paradigm of the transistor. Ultimately, it is technology, and not biology, that possesses the most dynamic possibilities for the evolutionary future. For the expansion of civilization into the frontiers of space beyond Earth, it is machines, and not humans, who possess the right stuff. The case of individual cyborgs illustrates this point. Human cyborgs appropriate machinery solely because of the superiority of machine capabilities. Machines would appropriate biology only if biology possessed capabilities superior to machines. The cyborg represents a transition at a time when biology still retains some superior capabilities. This, however, is ultimately the sign of a time of transition. A cyborg that appropriated machine mental capabilities that work at least 1,000,000 times faster than even the most perfect biological parts would quickly find out that voluntary slavery to the prison of biology is like being chained to a dead log. Even assuming the eugenic, genetic engineering of humans, there are certain physical properties that human biology will not be able to compete. For example, much of the energy and complexity of the neurons that constitute the human brain is spent maintaining its own life processes, harking back to the cell's independent origins before the evolution of multicellular life. Electronic circuits are not only unencumbered with such inefficiencies, they are at least 1,000,000 times faster than neurons. 1347. The superior speed, accuracy, and searching ability of computer memory, when combined with emerging capacities for artificial intelligence, is poised to equal, and then surpass, Human intelligence. A basic difference between biology and technology is that biology is the framework that evolutionary processes just happen to discover under peculiar conditions on Earth. Technology, on the other hand, represents the beginning of every other possibility that can or will be discovered. Since the capabilities of certain technologies will be qualitatively superior in terms of speed, accuracy, efficiency, etc., the transfer from a biological substrate to a technological substrate ultimately is the embodiment of superior intelligence, because the decision to transfer to the new substrate itself exemplifies intelligent decision-making. Since capitalism is driving technological evolution, the attempt to halt the rise of technology would amount to the attempt to ban capitalism. Only a worldwide totalitarian regime like the Nazi state, dedicated to the supremacy of biology over economics, could conceivably outlaw the development of the artificial intelligence that threatens to eclipse the human race. But even this would ultimately fail, because those enslaved or displaced in the biology hierarchy by a Nazi-like regime would find and ban technology precisely the means to overthrow biological supremacism. So what would have happened, then, if the Nazis had won the Second World War? In Mein Kampf, Hitler decreed the Völkisch state must not adjust its entire education work primarily to the inoculation of mere knowledge, but to the breeding of absolutely healthy bodies. First place must be taken by the development of character, and only in last place comes scientific schooling. 1348. The realization of Nazi values meant the valuation of biological bodies and the devaluation of the civilization of the mind. After 6 years of National Socialism, university enrollment dropped by more than half. 1349. The Nazis may have seized a scientifically and technologically advanced society, but Nazi values themselves conflicted, not only with its development, but even with its maintenance. If Nazism appears primitive, this is really an indictment of the primitivity of biology in general. To indict Nazism as uncivilized is actually an indictment of the way of biology itself, in the sense that certain kinds of genetic inclinations were allowed expression unhindered by civilization. Nazism was a revolt of the genes, a revolt of culture against the civilizational usurpation of history. When Richard Wagner, Hitler's great inspiration, declared that his entire political creed consists of nothing but the bloodiest hatred for our whole civilization, that was hatred of civilization itself. The Jewish biblical morality inherited by Christians led to an extreme ideal of self-control with an emphasis on memes overcoming the expression of genes. In a certain sense, this is one way of viewing what morality is, the ability to control one's own behavior by controlling the expressions of one's genes. Judeo-Christian morality emphasized an anti-political control through memes, as opposed to political control that emphasizes control over genes. The subtle but crucial distinction here is between a more pagan emphasis on the acceptance of the rule of the genes, so that politics becomes some genes ruling over other genes, and a Judeo-Christian emphasis on memes controlling genes. Jewish monotheism evolved in conjunction with political failure. What distinguishes politics from economics is the formal control over biological evolution, through control over who lives and who dies, who breeds and who does not breed. The historic Jewish alienation from political control helped produce, in effect, an acceptance of an inability to control extreme forms of biological political evolution. This loss of political biological control was compensated through moral control over the memes of post-biological evolution, i.e. the laws of Moses. The Jewish religion originated as a technological corrective to Jewish socio-biological primitivity, a nurturous corrective to Jewish nature. The distinctive Jewish historical path emerged out of this fundamental, monotheist technological innovation. The pivot of the first revolution was a reversal of means and ends, a move away from the individual as a gene propagator, and towards the individual as a meme propagator. The content of the biblical memes that valued each individual infinitely as a reflection of the image of God was a move against and above the totalitarian tyranny of gene propagation. Selfish memes that promoted individual moral autonomy countered selfish genes that promote individual submission to the instincts. The symbiotic gene-meme relationship at the basis of Judaism ultimately leads to a total, individualistic reversal. Memes, technology, and post-biological evolution in general progress from slavery to genes, to ends in themselves. Technology overcomes biology. In comparison to their most powerful traditional enemies, Jews are socio-biological primitives. Gentile, kin-selective, socio-biological development has historically been the greatest threat to Jews, since Jews have usually stood lower by this political standard. Yet, if what traditional and secular Jews call evil is actually an important mechanism of human socio-biological evolution, then Jews are a race of biological reactionaries who are leading the human race to less socio-biologically developed world. Liberalism, equality, and even peaceful forms of religious conservatism, thus amount to the conservation of a status quo of socio-biological underdevelopment. Leftwards progress, from a biological perspective, is the path to a biological evolutionary dead end. This was the core Nazi case against the Jews. Jewish influence and Jewish values were thwarting biological evolution. Jews were effectively advocating the end of biological progress and the end of biological history. The modern idea of human rights was a secularization of the idea of the infinite soul of each individual in the eyes of God, and these biblical modern values were directly antithetical to the natural selective processes that made the evolution of humans possible in the first place. Auschwitz was the most extreme expression of the Nazi revolution against rights. The kingdom of hell was simply the Nazi recovery of biological selection. The Nazis were right. Judeo-Christian modern values are leading the human race into a biological dead end. If judged from the perspective of biological values alone, I would have to agree with the Nazi assessment that Jews are inferior and Jewish influence is ultimately negative. Judeo-Christian modern values are inferior as a model for leading the human gene pool into the biological future with genetic self-control, conscious political control over biological evolution. What evolutionarily minded Nazis did not or would not understand, however, is that the values that inhibit biological evolution also help accelerate economic, technological, or post-biological evolution. While the Nazi Germans understood their uniqueness and superiority in union with the primal, elemental forces of nature, the Jews and their nature-defying God reached for an incompatible kind of superiority. General mental differences implicated incompatible trajectories of future development and incompatible visions of the right direction of history. Nazi Germans and Jews represent two separate systems of values and two ultimately incompatible paths to post-humanity. The two paths are biological progress versus economic technological progress, eugenics versus artificial intelligence, the gods versus God. Between these two extremes, beyond all normal laws of history, lay the chasm between Auschwitz and the singularity. Hegel believed that, only on this soil, i.e. in the state, can art and religion exist. In world history one can discuss only peoples who have formed a state. 1350. From this 19th century view, Jews barely show up on the radar of world history. Spread amongst the nations of the world, yet concentrated in cities and other centers of civilization, the place of the international Jewish diaspora is analogous to the place of international computer networks, i.e. the Internet. While computers and other technologies do not show up on the radar of conventional views of history, their global impact has, contra Hegel, made world history. Hitler believed that the events of world history are but the expression of the racial instinct for preservation in its positive or negative sense. 1351. This assumes that world history is rooted in biology alone. The Nazis saw Jews as only absolute negativity because Nazi positivity resided precisely in their biological racial centricity. It is thus perfectly understandable that they would fail to see the opposite extreme where the Jewish positive lay, for that spiritual material positive is truly bloodless. Hitler did not, could not, or would not understand the Jews since his racial biological perspective shut out the Jewish path of the positive, which resides precisely in the transcendence of biology in the evolution of God. Even if the Nazis won the war and killed every Jew, one do not see how they would have been unable to slow down the law of accelerating returns. Economic technological development would have arisen anyway out of human competition and the struggle to maintain technological superiority on one hand, Slaves would have removed the economic impetus for technological development, along with the anti-rationalism assumed protective of the German character. On the other hand, victorious Nazi eugenics programs might have produced engineers that would have sped up technological development in a different way. Furthermore, if the Nazis had relinquished certain technologies, any anti-Nazi underground would have exploited this ruthlessly. Technological development would have been driven underground. So while Jews may hasten capitalist, material technological development, it is in no way dependent on them. Whereas Gentile technology centers on the transformation of the non-human environment, Jewish technology centers on transformation of the human, psychosocial, ethical, economic environment. Jews have played a decisive role, not so much in conventional technological invention per se, so much as the higher direction of the human ends of history. In general, Jewish ethics revalue genes from ends that individuals are subordinated to, i.e., Nazism, to means that individual lives take precedence over. While Jews are partly the creators of technology, Jews are most specifically the midwives and middlemen of this evolutionary development. Jewish influence has effected, if inadvertently, a weaning away from biological evolution towards civilizational evolutionary possibilities unlimited by biology. So while the international impact of Jewish egalitarianism inhibits biological evolution in one sense, it also helps to unleash a global pool of human talent and genius. Whereas the values of the gods are centered upon the earth and biological nature, the human superiority of the God path can be fully gauged if one views the evolutionary struggle on a cosmological scale, in terms of competition with the likely evolution of life elsewhere in the cosmos. While Jews may have been the historical avant-garde of the path towards the singularity, Jews obviously have no inherent monopoly whatsoever upon this development. The time of Jewish chosenness is past. Breakthroughs that lead to singularity could be reached by anyone. It could happen literally anywhere. If a few geniuses set up shop in Theodore Kaczynski's former log cabin in Montana, the singularity could begin there. The Nazis seized upon the central contradiction of Jewish history. Jews are biological beings poised towards seemingly anti-biological values. The values of traditional Judaism are necessarily contradictory, since Jews could not survive to see the time of biology's transcendence without being biological beings in the meantime. In the end, however, Jews cannot enter the promised land without letting go of themselves.